I suppose Jane Austen is famous almost above all else for the way that she invented, I think is the right word, free indirect speech.
Yes.
And you write about this in your new book. And it's terribly important, isn't it? Particularly in Emma and the later books, the way she's developed this.
Yes, I mean, one can find traces of this technique, this free and direct style, in little traces in earlier novelists. But really, it's a bit of a miracle, actually, that Jane Austen did it, because she didn't do it talking to other writers about technique or anything. She wasn't like one of these great experimental writers like Joyce or Henry James, who very consciously decided what they were doing in response to other writers. She just sort of did it. And it's terrible.
Did it catching the consciousness of the reader in the way they think? Of the character in the way
Yes,
they
I mean,
think and speak.
What it meant was, in a sense, it was a solution to the problem that novelists had encountered in the previous century. Do you write a novel in the first person, from the point of view of the character, in which case you get into their head, but you don't know anything they don't know? Yeah. Or do you, so that's kind of Daniel Defoe or Samuel Richardson, or do you sit above it like God, like Henry Fielding did, in which case you know anything you want to know, but there's the big danger, your characters become like sort of chess pieces being moved around in the novelist's game. And Jane Austen discovered this extraordinary, brilliant solution to it, which novelists still often rely on, which was to narrate in the third person with all the possibilities for sort of irony and shifts of perspective that offered, but to do it filtered through the consciousness of a given character. What's extraordinary about Emma is how, not all the time, but about 98% of the time, it's filtered through the consciousness of one character, Emma, and in a brilliant sort of twist, as if Jane Austen hadn't just recently learnt this technique, but really wanted to show off with it, she decides to do it through the consciousness of a character who's completely wrong about everything. Yeah. So fantastic. So you experience her wrongness. You sort of share it. And it's, to put it simply, it's the reason why, it's the solution to the question that people often ask in puzzlement about Emma, which is, how can I like a character who's such a sort of vain, self-deluding, foolish, wrong-headed person? How can I? Because you're sort of in her head.
That's what's fascinating, isn't it? Jane Austen said when she took Emma that she was going to take a character that no one but herself would much like.
Yes.
But actually we do end up liking Emma because she's so warm-hearted and she's just so interesting. She's never dull.
Yes.
So you sort of almost feel you could make those mistakes too, don't you?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you, as it were, narrate the plot of Emma, you could make her sound a really bad person. After all, her meddling takes the chance of happiness that her stooge, her protege, Harriet Smith, has, and almost destroys it.
Yeah, she could have wrecked Harriet's life.
Yes. If we didn't have this wonderful comic plot, which by a series of sort of blunders and mischances brings happiness to everybody in the end, then, you know, she could have done a great deal of damage. But actually, that's not how we experience it. We experience it through the wrong-headed but endlessly sort of vivid and amused and amusing consciousness of Emma, who is described in a word which I think's never been used in English before as a great imaginist. She's an imaginist. And it's her life of imagining which we sort of relish as well as rather deploring.
Imagining other people's lives as she thinks they ought to be.
She's imagining plots all around her. I mean, we do this. You know, I mean, without being banal about it and saying, gosh, isn't life like a Jane Austen novel? She takes to extremes something which all of us do, all of us have to do, which is sort of imagining what other people are like and what's motivating them. And of course, we get it wrong. Yeah. She gets it wrong disastrously. She is convinced that in a brilliant, I think it's a brilliant sort of subplot, that Frank Churchill is courting her. And in fact, Frank Churchill, who's very clever and sort of cunning, really.
He's cunning.
Sees that she might think that and uses it as a blind for the fact that, of course, he's carrying on a relationship with Jane Fairfax. And it's a classic sort of, she constructs this plot and it's non-existent, this story. But, we all do that. And no doubt, if we were wealthy people in a kind of incredibly dull Surrey village in the early 19th century, what else has she got to do?
And that's it too, isn't it? The background of Emma, you're always reminded how dull life can be.
Absolutely. And it's a sort of, you can see that, one way of thinking of Jane Austen's novels is that each sort of heroine was a reaction against the preceding one. So just as after she invented Elizabeth Bennet, who misunderstands even her own feelings and misjudges the man that she eventually discovers she loves. And who's the most lively and vivid person ever. She then thinks, I'll have a heroine, Fanny Price in Mansfield Park, who spends a lot of time not talking and who's pious and quiet and put upon. Yeah. And then, having done that, it's as if she thinks, well, that was interesting, that powerless heroine. Now I'm going to have a heroine who's omnipotent. She can do whatever she wants. Yes. She's got money. She's the queen of Highbury, but she's the queen of this zone where nothing happens, apparently, where the only thing that people have to do is to sort of hug their illnesses to themselves. The sort of the one person in the village who's doing really, really well is the apothecary, Mr. Perry, who's ministering to everybody's malade imaginaire. So she has too much time, too much power, and she sets out on her matchmaking and brings almost disaster to almost everybody.
And of course she's 21, isn't she, I think, when the novel begins, but in some ways she almost seems younger than that in the way that she approaches life, whereas Mr. Knightley seems a bit older. Well, it's as if they come towards each other.
Yes.
Mr. Knightley gets younger and she gets older.
Yes, I mean, you can read Emma and just look at Mr. Knightley. Just watch him and what happens to him. And it's a fascinating thing because at the beginning
he gets things wrong too.
He gets things wrong, but he's introduced at the beginning of the novel as this man of 37 or 38. Jane Austen's even vague about the age, as if she's not quite sure. He's sort of he's apparently beyond the sort of age of courtship shenanigans. So she sets up this thing that there's this love interest, which we as readers must sense is likely. She tells us in the first chapter that he's the only person in the world who ever sees faults in Emma, and certainly the only person who ever tells her about them. Now that seems to me to be saying, right, they're going to get married. They've got to get, that's it. But they mustn't see it. Now, famously, Emma doesn't see it until the moment that she thinks she's going to lose him to Harriet Smith. And then suddenly, with the speed of an arrow, she realises he's got to be for me. But actually, if you look carefully, there's another story, Mr. Knightley's story, as he slowly gets, through jealousy, which is one of Jane Austen's favourite sort of emotions in men, through jealousy, he becomes a different sort of person.
Jealousy of Frank Churchill.
Jealousy of Frank Churchill. And he starts being jealous when Frank Churchill's just mentioned. Oh, he's always at some seaside resort or other. He's always footling around, wasting his time. Blah, 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 blah. He goes very red in the face where he's putting on some gaiters. And he gets cross. And Emma sees his grumpiness, but doesn't perceive what's at the root of it. And he gradually is, as it were, changed into, a potential partner for her. And there's a very striking moment of sort of rejuvenation at the dance, at the Crown, where all sorts of things are going on. It starts wonderful. I mean, if it's as great as any ball in Tolstoy or Flaubert or anything. Fantastic interthreading of all the various plots and misunderstandings. And right at the end of it, Mr. Knightley rescues Harriet Smith, who's been humiliated by Mr. Elton and dances with her. And Emma's never seen him dance before. And she doesn't like seeing him standing with all the old men and all the fatzos who are standing around, who are the whist players, the men who don't dance because they're not interested in
And she
that
suddenly
anymore.
realises he looks rather good.
Yes, and he's good at dancing, which is an important kind of erotic skill in a man, as we know from Pride and Prejudice. And he's really good at dancing, and he looks great. And of course, right at the end, he asks her to dance, and she says to him, well, it'd be fine because it wouldn't be like brother and sister. And he says famously, not like brother and sister at all. Yes. End of chapter. And then we know it isn't just we know. He sort of seems to know what's going on.
Virginia Woolf, who hugely admired Jane Austen, as you tell us, compared her once with George Eliot, saying that George Eliot allows her heroines to talk too much, and she lacks the unerring taste which chooses one sentence and compresses the heart of a scene into it. "Whom are you going to dance with?" asks Mr. Knightley at the Westons' ball. "With you, if you will ask me," said Emma. Yes. And she'd said enough. Mrs. Casaubon in Middlemarch would have talked for an hour and we'd have looked out of the window.
Well, I think that's very true. I think, that example, with you, if you'll ask me, it is brilliantly economical. It's brilliantly economical, of course, because it's the nearest a woman ever gets in Jane Austen to asking a man to dance. You can't ask, a woman can only decide to accept or decline. And that process, as Henry Tilney says in Northanger Abbey, it's a bit like marriage, dancing. The woman has to wait to be asked. She only has the power of refusal. So this is as near as Emma can get to sort of propositioning Mr. Knightley, with you, if you'll ask me. And it does have brilliant economy. And in that way, I think Woolf is right. There's something a little bit like Shakespeare with Jane Austen. She wants to do something, she does it. She just does it. Yeah. And with a kind of brevity that slightly takes your breath away. And of course, there she's done it. She's suddenly brought these two together in a relationship which isn't any longer the sort of mentor with the sort of little girl, a spoilt little girl. It's something different. And Emma doesn't quite realise that it's different, but we certainly do.
In a funny way, when they finally do get together, that whole thing of Emma saying that she'll go on calling him Mr. Knightley, because she wants to remind herself, doesn't she, what terrible mistake she might have made, and she clings to that.
Yeah, well, yes, and I suppose, it's not so unusual for husbands and wives to call themselves Mr. and Mrs., call each other Mr. and Mrs. or Admiral. The most happily married people in Jane Austen, Admiral and Mrs. Croft in Persuasion, and he calls her Sophie, but she calls him my dear Admiral. So it's not so unusual, especially what you must remember that after all that a sort of informality between spouses, which we've seen with Mr. and Mrs. Elton, is perhaps not a very sort of good example.
Do you think the mood in the late Jane Austen novels is different to the mood in the early ones? Pride and Prejudice ends very happily.
Yeah.
Emma ends happily too, but I think some critics have said that there's a sort of sadness there too, a feeling that village life can be quite dull, as we talked about.
I don't think that Emma is in any ways a melancholy novel. I think her last novel, Persuasion. In some ways is. And we should remember that, these novels, these 6 novels, although some of them were based on earlier versions, which she had to hand, essentially they were written and finished within 6 years of each other. 6 novels in 6 years, incredible. And so, although we might see a sort of arc of change over it, she's writing them in a very concentrated period, and one shouldn't perhaps go too far down the path of saying, her views on life changed or anything, because I think it was the same, in some sense, the same middle-aged woman who was writing all those novels. And I think Emma is I don't think it is a melancholy novel. I think it's a novel which, like Mansfield Park and Pride and Prejudice, sees the sort of ghastliness of the unhappiness that it manages to rescue its characters from. I mean, famously in Emma, when she thinks that Harriet Smith is going to get Mr. Knightley, she suddenly contemplates what life is going to be like. Endless backgammon with her dad, you know, and it's raining, it's July, it's raining, and there's a sort of almost existential gloom. And you know, it says
Mrs. Bates.
Yes, and she's going to have to spend her life sort of, you know, chatting to Miss Bates and people like that. But you know, then the next chapter comes, the weather changes, and Emma's never good at being very miserable for very long, you know. So, and I think that's what the novel's like too.